All right, I am going to go ahead and get us started. So welcome everybody to our session called Climate Change Can Be a Good Thing, during which we'll talk about strategies at the state level for improving school climate at the school level. I'm really excited to have a super awesome panel here with us today. We'll have a chance to hear directly from them in introductions in just a minute, but just wanted to start with some minor or basic housekeeping. I just put into the chat box the social media handles as well as the hashtag for the session if anyone who is viewing would like to follow along on social media and share on social media. I would certainly encourage people to do that. So you have everyone's handles as well as the hashtag. So just encourage you to share along as we're going and share what you're learning in this really exciting conversation. We have about 55 minutes to dig in, and we will spend about half of that time in conversation with our panelists and half of that time in conversation with you. So that does not mean we need to hold all of our questions until the end of the session, however, so would encourage you if you have questions at any point in the conversation just to drop those into the chat box. If you have reactions to anything that anyone has shared throughout the conversation, to drop that into the chat box, and generally encourage you to use the chat box just to inspire and have some dynamic dialogue and conversation. It's kind of hard sometimes to be doing everything over Zoom and video, and we want this to be a dialogue with you. So if someone says something that you agree with or that you disagree with, please share that as well in the chat box. But certainly want to encourage as much questions as we can have as we are going. As I mentioned, this is all Zoom, or not Zoom, all virtual, and people are fairly used to that by now, but this is a slightly different platform for some of us, and so just wanted to note the chat box should be on the bottom right of your screen, so just click on Room Chat if you're seeing it there, and you can put your message in right there, and we'll be monitoring that chat box as we go. With that, I'm going to go ahead and ask each panelist to go ahead and introduce themselves. As I mentioned, it is a really exciting panelist. I've had the chance to get to know each of them over the past couple of years, Krupa much more recently, and looking forward to the conversations. But I want to turn it over to each of you just to introduce yourselves. And I've asked our panelists to share their name, their role, and something that you wouldn't know from reading their bio, but is important to share. So I will go ahead and start with Krupa.
Hi, I'm Krupa. I'm a senior here in high school here in Kentucky, and I'm also a member of the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team, where we do a lot of student-led research on climate, on school climate, and students' perceptions of their school climate. Something that isn't on my bio that is important to know is probably that I've spent a lot of time in school, so I feel very knowledgeable about a school experience from a student's perspective, and I'm excited to share that with Ray and Carrie here today in this conversation.
Great, thank you so much. It's so important to have the student perspective represented, and while I know you cannot represent every student in the nation, we're really happy to hear what you have to contribute because your lived experience is expertise, and we hope you'll bring that to the conversation as well as sharing what you're hearing and learning from students across Kentucky. Carrie, I'll turn to you next for your introduction.
Hi, Carrie Wright, State Superintendent of the great state of Mississippi. And one thing that you will never find on my bio, but I'm so very proud of, is this little grandson of mine who happens to be about 16 months old. So that's very special.
Thank you. That's always special. I want to see pictures now. Ray, we'll turn to you next.
Thank you so much. Well, it's on with Krupa and Superintendent Wright from the great state of Mississippi, and President and CEO of Communities in Schools, a national nonprofit working with trained site coordinators inside at the invitation of schools. You'll find this in my bio, but I thought it was important to note I'm also a product of Communities in Schools, so I'm an alumni of the program in San Antonio, Texas. But something you won't find is over the last 10 months, I've become obsessed with an Instagram person named Half Baked Harvest. So now I love cooking every Friday. Since we're in this pandemic, I've made some lemonade out of lemons.
That's fantastic. Perhaps we can share some recipes at some time too, and even actually share a meal once this is all over. So thank you all for sharing just a little bit more about yourselves and helping to sort of set the context for who you are as human beings, beyond just the titles and the resume, because we know that understanding who people are as humans and understanding and building relationships is just critical to how we interact into society, but also essential to how students learn. And so I want to dig into that next by starting with some definitions. And just as a question for all of the panelists, our title is Climate Change Can Be a Good Thing. We're talking about school climate though. So I'd love if you could just set some context, each of you, by letting me know, how are you defining school climate? We'll reverse the order. We'll start with Ray.
Yep, happy to do so. The question of school climate, I think for us, even at Communities in Schools, we've been working in schools for about 43 years as a nonprofit agency, able to work with students, case manage in many cases. But the higher sort of aspiration for our work with our site coordinators is to really work on that unit of change that is the school, not necessarily just the case managed student that we're working with to ensure grade promotion, attendance, dropout prevention. And school climate for us, we've been doing a lot of research on how to assess it, how to deploy it with an individual, but really it's everyone's job on a school campus. And the best definition that we can really give is if folks remember what it was like when you walked into a school and felt safe or even unsafe, giving you indicators of this being a welcoming place. We have site coordinators who work in schools with a diverse population, and oftentimes it means whether you as a student coming from a different country, speaking a different language, can feel well in your school environment. The same goes for the most important element of our work at Communities in Schools. Can you develop a connection or relationship with an adult there, whether it's your principal, a counselor, your teacher, or in our case, our site coordinators who work directly with students. So school climate for us is really that sense of a feeling. In many ways, you talked about what's the difference between perhaps culture and conditions for learning. Those feed into the climate, things around the tone of equity from leadership, the curriculum that students are using and learning from, and you can't ignore the non-academic issues that a student is confronting. To ask them to leave all of those issues outside of the school door doesn't allow them to be their full selves and doesn't allow them to really connect in that way. That's what we believe is possible with school climate that is impacting student learning. With everything we know about the research around youth development, it's so critical for schools. So it can be a good thing.
Great, thank you. Carrie?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when people think of school climate, they think of discipline. And school climate is just so much greater than the disciplining of children. You know, it goes to the essence, I think I refer to it, having been a principal for a number of years, it's the safe place that children need to know that they can come to each and every day. And not only safe to feel physically safe, but emotionally, safe as well. They've got to have a place where they can make mistakes, feel free to express themselves and whatever their opinions are, and know that it's a place that people are going to be accepting of that and also helping them grow accordingly. The other thing I think, having been a principal, school climate sets the climate really sets the whole tone of the school. And you can know when you walk into the front door of any school building, you feel the climate, whether it's a good feel or a not so good feel. And once you walk the halls, you will also see that. You'll also see that in your interactions with adults and children inside the building. And so for me, climate sets the conditions for learning. Because if you don't have a good school climate, you can have great teachers, but if kids aren't feeling that connectedness to the adults and to each other, then you've not really set a climate that does set the conditions for learning.
Thank you. Krupa.
I'll start off by seconding everything that Ray and Carrie have said so far. I think it's super important to note that idea of not only physical safety, but emotional safety in that space as well. And I think Carrie was starting to touch on this idea that students themselves must be perceiving that positive school climate in order for it to be a positive school climate. And I think that's something that's very important to note in this discussion is that if students' self-perception of their climate isn't one that's positive and isn't one that they feel like they can belong in and something that they feel included in, students themselves aren't set up in a way that they can learn productively. And so I think that's something really important to note about school climate is that a student's perception of it must be positive. It can't just be something that's, metrics based or something that on paper looks great. I think something to note is how do students in that school building and outside that school building feel about their school climate is something that's important to note when we define school climate.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this question of how do you both define it, but how do you measure it is critical, particularly if about the role of policy. So we'll definitely hit on that later in the conversation. But just wanted to pull out a little bit of what I heard from each of our panelists. So really it is the feeling of a school. It is how you feel inside of that building, inside of that classroom, the strength of the relationships or the connections that each student has with the adults in the building as well as with their peers. I heard about tone. I heard about the degree of focus on equity, discipline and discipline policy, or at least how behavior is managed within a school, how it's spoken about. And I think importantly, Carrie's point that a positive, safe, supportive climate basically enables learning. It sets the conditions for learning. So it's a prerequisite to academic learning. It's important to acknowledge just the way that we know the human brain works now, or the way that we now know how the human brain works, is that physiologically the human brain cannot take in information if it feels under threat. And that feels particularly relevant for education all the time, but right now, especially given what has happened over the past 8 months with the pandemic, as well as the racial reckoning and conversations that we've been having on race and racism in our country. So I wanted to turn next or back to you, Krupa. If you could just tell us a little bit about how the Pritchard Committee Student Voice has risen to address these issues and some of the work that you have taken on to address COVID as well as the racial reckoning, and maybe just a little bit about what the Pritchard Committee Student Voice team is as well.
Yeah, so I'll just start off by saying the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team is a group of about 100 or so Kentucky students from all across the state who really recognize that student voice and student action is something essential for schools to be able to function productively. And so we've been fascinated with this idea of school climate and what does that really mean for students in Kentucky for a couple years now. And I think we first really started to look into this idea of school climate through what we called our school climate audits, in which we, as the student voice team, would go into different schools and do basically a survey on their students and look at how those students were perceiving different things regarding their education. And we really started to notice this idea of a positive school climate positively affecting students, which doesn't seem like a very big idea, but to have that reckoning and that notion was something very important to us. But then I think we started to realize that us coming into a school isn't as impactful and isn't as formative as students themselves in that school doing this work, because they're the ones who are experiencing whatever that school's policies and practices are on a daily basis. So we kind of have transitioned to this model in which we have students themselves in that school conducting these school climate audits, and we kind of serve as consultors helping them through that process of doing a climate audit themselves. And I think that really shows and is a testament to the fact that students are the best understanders of how their school climate is. So I think that has been a really enriching process to be able to look at. But then this past March and April, we were really faced with this moment of COVID and how that would impact school climate. And we decided to embark upon something that was rooted in these school climate audits, but something that was also a lot bigger was this Coping with COVID student-to-student study, which we actually disseminated the survey in May, and we disseminated it across the state of Kentucky rather than based in one school. And I think we're still sifting through the sheer amount of data we were able to acquire, but I think it's really been this moment of reckoning that school is not just limited to the four walls that define a school. For a lot of students, what they're experiencing at home is brought into the school, and especially now with so many schools being virtual, I think it's just exacerbated in this moment. And I think that's something that we have to recognize and come to terms with when we're defining school climate. Is it's not just the four the four walls around a school. It's really what a student is bringing into that school that will help define their school climate and their perception of climate.
I'd love to hear any reactions from Ray or Carrie to what Krupa has shared about the work in Kentucky and any connections that you can make to your work.
Well, I'll start by saying that there's such power in student voice, and I can't underscore that enough. And that, in fact, our state board felt so strongly about it that we now have 2 student reps that serve on our state board, and every month they come with a report, et cetera. But I think that the reason I think that student voice is so powerful is because they're on the receiving end of the education that we're providing, right? And they're in the schools, and it's one thing to hear from adults, because adults say, yeah, things are going great. And then you meet a group of kids and go, yeah, well, not so much. And so I felt so strongly about it. I formed a student advisory council, and we started out relatively small with about 50, and we're now well over to 150. And I meet with them on a regular basis. And if you want to know how things are going, ask students, because I love it. They set the agenda. When I'll say, what is it you want to talk about? And there may be things that I want to bring to their attention, because one of the things that I think is really important is that they need to know, and they've asked some great questions too, about how does it work, right? How does the State Department of Education work? What's your job? What's your role? What do you do? You know, versus why doesn't my school have X, right? Why doesn't my school have, you know, whatever the case might be? But I think that they're ambassadors, I think, to me, because I can't be in, 148 districts every single day, but I can meet with my students on a regular basis, and my teachers and my principals and my superintendents on a regular basis to hear their voice, because the decisions that I make are going to impact them. And so I think the more that we can hear from them about what their needs are, what is and is not happening across the state, that's going to better put me in a position to make better policy that is going to then guide the kinds of things that should be happening in schools that may not be.
Thank you so much for sort of elevating the importance that I know a lot of the folks here in this call know about the student voice and the importance of it. I just want to say I was a huge fan of the Pritchard Community Student Voice before this call, but for folks who may not have had the experience I had, I got to see that student-to-student survey that Krupa referenced. One item I thought was really great, and I think the entire data set that you've got, some really amazing numbers, but some of the pulled out quotes from students were really just kind of hit me in the way that I think you can't feel when you are not in schools talking to students. It said during the regular school years, teachers would take the time to check in on us. Big deal. Teachers have a lot on their plate already, but even in this quote from the student, the sophomore, was that they would take the time to check in on us, but since quarantine started, there's less emotional support, which has made me feel very alone. And they go on to say, I don't want to reach out to the teacher and bother them. And that is, I think, something that should worry us, because the sense that when we think about school and a great climate, it allows that kind of interaction. Maybe it's not as dramatic as trauma that student is feeling. Maybe they with another adult. But when we take the school out of the equation, which we've had to do during the quarantine, it puts us in a position where I would be worried, certainly with the student population that we work with, around students, particularly those hardest hit, suffering in silence and not wanting to reach out because perhaps they don't want to bother a teacher who could be overwhelmed learning a new virtual learning experience. But I thought that the student-to-student survey really gave a great snapshot of the work happening in Kentucky. The importance of making sure that we're checking in on students.
Yeah, really fascinating what you learn when you talk to students, when you ask students, and I think when you ask families as well. And so really super appreciative to Krupa and the Pritchard Student Voice team for giving us that model for student organizing, for student voice, but also for student-led work on climate and leadership. Carrie, you alluded a little bit to how your student advisory panel helps provide you the information that you need in order to better understand student needs. I want to get to that in a little bit, but I want to stay with Ray. If you can share just a little bit about, maybe a little more about what Communities in Schools is and does, and in particular, if you could just focus on the role of the school-based coordinators and connect for us how that might relate to school climate.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are an organization that's been around for 43 years. Our founder, his name is Bill Milliken, started on the notion that is pretty simple to explain, that at the end of the day, CIS is an organization, and I know that Superintendent Wright knows about programs that are invited into school or work with schools. At the end of the day, programs don't change students' lives, relationships do. And today, the most valuable asset that Communities in Schools has is 3,500 site coordinators that are working all across the country. We're in 25 states, working with 2,800 schools today, serving close to 1.6 million students. And that building of a relationship was tested, to steal a line from Krupa, around school not being just the four walls. It was, what does it look to be an organization, Communities in Schools, working where the hub of where you can find students of most need, when that shuts down and or schools are quarantined and everybody is away from school for several months. And so for us, the mantra behind me is that in schools and beyond was the site coordinator working with that critical component of a relationship. And I'll tell you how it manifested itself and how I think it should speak to this future of public education and what is a necessary component and not a nice to have, which is somebody who is focusing on those non-academic concerns, which is what our site coordinators work on, whether it's around food insecurity, housing insecurity, instability with the family. Perhaps they have an unsafe home environment. They need to share that with somebody, but they need to build a relationship before they're ready to share those kinds of elements in their life. And so the way that was tested is we oftentimes, working with schools, were put to the task of finding students who weren't showing up for virtual learning. So our 3,500 site coordinators had to actually go out, knock on doors. If no one was there, can we talk to the last person who may have saw Ray and or Amanda? And that work is terribly difficult. And it's harder to get somebody to answer the door if they don't have a relationship with you yet. And so in many cases, the doors that would be open to us was because they knew Mrs. Reyes, who was their site coordinator that had been working with them for 2 years, for 3 years. And that kind of relationship is, I think, what is critical when it comes to these connections that we need to be making with students. And that is the work of the 3,500 site coordinators that we have working all across the country at CIS. We talk a lot about evaluation and assessments and tools in the hands of these site coordinators for the pieces around social emotional connection. And it's interesting because a lot of those tools for evaluation, folks just assume it goes into a big database. But asking a question to a student that is beyond just how are you doing today, but gets into what is missing at home, what are the conditions that you need, that really develops a rapport. So we think about those tools in the hands of trained site coordinators in schools all across the country, and that's, I think, the new important element to public education as we're thinking about how schools reopen in an equitable way.
Thanks, Ray. I'd love to hear a little bit more from each of you, just what you're hearing from students and families in particular, just about how they're feeling. And that's one of the questions that Ray just put on the table, how important it is to ask that question. How are they doing? Carrie, I do want to get to state policy and how you collect data and use that around how you know if the kids are all right. But I'd love to just hear, before we jump into that, what are you hearing about how the students and families are doing in your communities?
Did you want me to take that first?
That's for everybody, but you can go first.
Oh, okay. Well, we're hearing a variety of things. I mean, there's some parents that when everybody had to go virtual, they were very comfortable with it. I would say that the vast majority of parents are not there. I think that a lot of parents were frustrated at having to try and manage this and manage their lives and manage to work. particularly if they had multiple children. I think the level of frustration with teachers around this as well is because I think the teachers didn't feel prepared, right? They just didn't feel that they had the skill sets that they needed. And that is very daunting to a teacher, because a teacher always wants to feel competent and, and in charge. The students, though, were very interesting to talk to during this entire time. They were feeling very disconnected, very alone. I heard a lot from not only the board reps, but from my student advisory council, a fear of a lot of their fellow friends feeling depressed, and this whole sense of being disconnected from everything, a level of frustration around the only way I can really talk to my friends is, by using my phone. We can't get together. Missing the interaction, this is missing what human beings are used to, right? Human beings are used to that social interaction, that face-to-face conversation, picking up on the affect, being able to, just hug somebody when they're feeling down, right? And kids learn from each other. Learning is so all-encompassing. It's not just the academic part of it, it's the social part of it. And, when you think about band or choir or some things that in some of those schools, they didn't have band or choir because of all of the issues around it. So they lost out on that. And I think that that's really the part that I worry about the most now. To be honest with you, academics is something we can talk about, but this whole idea of children's social and emotional well-being is what they then bring to the learning environment. And I think as adults, we really need to be very sensitive to that. I was raised in an era that, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you just keep on walking, right? And forget the fact that you may have been not feeling like putting up your bootstraps at all, but curling up on a couch and putting a blanket over you. But I think that, thank God we've come a long way and that we're more sensitive to children's needs. I think that that to me is a part that I really think our counselors are going to need to focus on. I think a lot of schools did. I think a lot of counselors and schools spent the first part of the year just on school climate, just on, aren't you glad you're back? And let's talk about what you went through. And just that connectedness that kids needed to feel before academics could even take place, because there was a lot that they needed to share and a lot that they needed to get off their chest. And as adults, it's our job to take all that in. And as you're listening, figure out what is it then that I as a teacher or a principal need to do in order to help this child that may be differently help than that child.
Great, thank you. Krupa, Ray, anything else you would share from what you're hearing from families or students?
Yeah, I think something that we've been noticing in our survey data and just in me talking to my friends is that everybody's experience with at least academic learning throughout this pandemic is very different. Some students love the flexibility of online learning, whereas other students want that face-to-face learning and being able to be in a classroom. But I think a common thread throughout all of this is that idea that students are craving that social interaction and that social aspect of school. I remember reading a response where a student was just like, I'm able to talk to my friends, but I miss just seeing people in a hallway and being able to walk by them. And I think that that's something that's what students are craving in this moment, is that idea of being able to connect with their peers. And I remember in an interview that I was able to do, one student stated that in their Zoom classes, they would have 5 minutes at the end of class just to talk to their friends on Zoom. And I think that that was something that they really appreciated in that moment. I think that's really a testament to how much students are really wanting that ability to connect with not only their peers, but also, like Ray said, their teachers, their counselors, being able to have even adult mentor figures that they're able to connect to in this moment. But I think something else we're also seeing in this time is that students are having to take on new roles in their household as they're trying to manage both their academics, and oftentimes students are, taking care of siblings or working as essential workers at a grocery store. And I think that that's also something that they're coming into a classroom with now, is managing this pandemic along with their academics. And they're taking on these new roles within their household and also within society that they're coming to the classroom with now. And I think that that's also something that will influence how they perceive their own school climate.
All right, looks like we lost your audio. You want to try again? All right, well, we are trying to get Ray back. I'm going to go ahead and turn to you, Carrie. We've promised a couple of times to get into state policy, so I'd love to hear from you. What are the implications of state leadership? How are you collecting the data? How are you creating the conditions for this focus on climate to even happen in schools?
Well, a couple of things. The first thing that was first and foremost on my mind was accounting for all children, because we had seen, a drop in enrollment, and that's not unusual, but this was a rather large drop in enrollment. And so we've got school attendance officers around the state. And so my charge to them was, we need to find every single child that was enrolled in the spring, that is not enrolled in the fall, and find out why. Because simply staying home without an education was not an option. So we had to make sure, were they transferring to another school? Did they go to private school? Did they become homeschooled? What the issue was, because that to me, and we're still working on that, to be honest with you. I've got a big meeting Friday afternoon on this to get the latest count, because my responsibility is for all children across the state and to ensure that they're getting the education. So that was the first piece of policy that we really looked at. The other thing we did, we surveyed the districts too, to find out where they were with not only the population that was there, but what were their formative assessments showing them. We talk about academics. Were they seeing kids coming in, was lower, their scores lower than they were the past year, or were they higher than the previous year? Because we also wanted to make sure that we were monitoring that, so that drives our decision making. In other words, are there resources at the state level then that we need to be providing districts based on their data that students may need? And we've also just we pushed it out early, it's still in draft, but our social emotional standards. We developed a brand new K-12 group of social emotional standards, and a lot of resources and guides that went with that, lesson plans, how to embed that in teaching. We did not want this to be seen as, oh, now it's time for social emotional learning, get out your whatever. It has to be infused in what you do each and every day, your every interaction with children. So our new social emotional standards were pushed out early to our districts. We've done a lot of virtual PD so that teachers are getting familiar with how to do that, and then it's not seen as an add-on. Because we wanted to hit both the academic side and the social emotional side, because it's not just one or the other.
Great, absolutely. Thank you for that. Ray, did you want to try and get in? See if your audio is working.
Hi, Danielle. Can you hear me okay now?
Gotcha.
Okay, great. I was just really kind of listening in to Superintendent Wright, and just really my hat goes off to what a difficult job it is right now to be a state level chief, policymaker, director of large schools that are all looking to sort of shuffle as, what does a reopened school look like? When are we ever going to get this right? And I think there is a lot of grace that should be afforded everyone on earth as we experience this, but most particularly those who are trying to handle what we have now appreciated much more. And I've seen headline after headline about the appreciation of the work teachers are doing and school principals are doing to try to get this right. And I also see in some cases, some criticism that comes the way at some of these leaders making some really tough decisions. And what we know at Communities in Schools and working with school leadership is that there is a ton of stress and anxiety on the leadership at these schools. And I worry about what we do to try to prevent the burnout that can happen with many of our educators who are doing everything they can to close the digital divide, but also recognize that they are people as well. And because they're people as well, they're also wanting to try to build something when schools return back to any semblance of the way they used to be in a better fashion. And to that extent, I know that Superintendent Wright, talking about social emotional learning, what we are assessing, the tools that we put in the hands of our school leadership or those partners we allow into our schools are going to be critical, because students will come back certainly with disruptions to learning loss, but they will come back with some trauma that it won't easily display itself externally. And carrying that level of anxiety, trauma, depression is going to be something that this generation of young students and the educators looking after them are, unfortunately, we're going to have to learn as quickly as possible, but be laser focused on those students who we know were suffering before the pandemic, and the stories of those students who were homeless, who were struggling with violence in the home or with the absence or loss of parents, just makes us, I hope, a bit smarter about this constant evolution of public education, that we are constantly trying to improve it, to get it right. A quick anecdote. Back in the 60s, I'm in San Antonio where I'm making this call. It's also where I grew up. Back in the 60s, CBS came and did a huge study on hunger in America, focused on San Antonio, focused on Louisiana and 2 other states. They were talking then about a policy level change that would be new to public education, which would be make lunch free for students. So I think as we consider what would change as a result of this pandemic, with educators and policymakers hopefully funding some of these new supports, we're able to not only get the tools to measure social emotional engagement of our students, trauma-informed care, but that we can also fund the people who will be deploying this. And there's, having been at the local level and serving in office at the local level, nothing worse than an unfunded mandate. There will be a lot of calls for change. There will be a lot of calls for improvements. And I hope that at the federal and state level, we can do right to invest in improving this thing we call public education, especially for a demographic of students that in many cases, more Black or brown students who are disproportionately impacted, and many students of low income who are hit hardest.
Yeah, there were 2 specific recommendations that you called out there that I want to pull out a little bit more. So those were tools and people. So we do have a question in the chat box about both of those things, and so I want to talk about each. So measuring is one. How do we measure climate? And are there any promising practices, best practices out there? And in particular, any specific role for state leaders and state policymakers in measuring climate?
Well, I would say yes to that. In fact, that's something that we're thinking about doing. We didn't start out with that, with the accountability model at all, because I wasn't confident that it would be accepted as reliable and valid if it was built into an accountability model. So one thing that we're looking at is to administer a survey, report the results of the survey, but not embed it in an accountability model, so that people will get the results, communities will get the results, parents will get the results, but not necessarily then awarding points, if you will, based on, how the respondents come in. I think that that's a really critical key. I think we've come a long way in the development of climate surveys to really get at that. I remember, when I was a principal, there was an effective school survey that was out that we gave every year, and got a lot of great data that we used to drive decisions that we made at the school. So to me, that's the best thing to do, is to put it in the hands of the people, the principals, the teachers, the students that are going to, that's their climate. And then be honest with, look at the results, and then just be honest and have the conversations about what needs to change. Because if you don't collect the data and you don't address the data, the issues are never going to go away. And so that's just where I come from, using it as a learning tool.
Yeah, so thank you for mentioning the school climate surveys, for which there are several in practice, several in state policy. And I think across the 50 states, you've got a full range of states who have not yet adopted or used a climate survey statewide, all the way to states like California or Illinois, who do have a requirement or do have a prescribed or allowable survey that is required of all districts and all schools to use. So there's lots of data out there, lots of validation out there, lots of studies and tests, and I think positive validation studies to really show that measuring matters. But to Carrie's point, it's not just measuring, it's actually using the data. And so figuring out how we get that data into the hands of the people who need it most, which in this case is really principals and teachers. And if we think about the role of the principal in terms of shaping and improving the culture and the climate within the school, this type of information is critical. talking about climate surveys, those are certainly surveys that are administered to students, as well, though, as to teachers, to your point, Carrie, to educators and community members in the family. And so thinking about how you get that 360 view of how people experiencing and feeling, or what is the tone of the school. But just to acknowledge, I heard a couple of other measures of climate that I want to make sure I'm pulling out and stating more explicitly. Carrie, you talked directly about attendance data or chronic absence data. And so finding the students, certainly even prior to the pandemic, understanding who was attending and who wasn't attending and why is an important measure of climate. Carrie, at the beginning, you also mentioned discipline. So looking at the data that we have on suspension and expulsion, of course, by race and other disaggregated factors, but those are also important measures of how students and how adults in the building are experiencing discipline. And then one last measure that we haven't touched on yet actually is just classroom observations. And certainly those are challenging now in this virtual world, but not impossible. So thinking through sort of what does it look like to have a full slate of measurement tools. Before we go on to the second part of the question around supporting the mental health needs of students and teachers, just want to pause and see if there's anything else that Krupa or Ray wanted to add to the measurement part of the question.
I wanted to just state that data and surveys are great ways to get widespread trends and ideas about it. But I also think something that we also love to do at the Student Voice team is to have these peer-to-peer conversations and interviews, and that also have very enriching data that we can get from students. I think oftentimes in data and big scale data, we tend to forget about, an individual's experiences. And I think doing those peer-to-peer interviews really allows us to learn from one individual's experience that might not be fitting with the trend, and how can we cater what we're doing to best help that individual is also something really important to know. And I think when we select our interviews, we try to get students who might not have experiences that fit with the norm. They're those students that Ray is talking about who are experiencing, violence in their homes, or they might be food insecure. And I think talking to those students in a peer-to-peer format is a way that we can get information on how to best help them in that situation. That is a voice that tends to often be drowned out in those widespread surveys and things like that, that I also think is something really important to note.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think just another important component of that is agency. And so providing agency to students and families to own the data, to own the information, to dig into the information, to interpret it, and to actually use it is critical to their buy-in to the process, but also to the ability to make change. Ray, it looked like you wanted to get in as well.
Yeah, just to say that there is, I think, as you described, Danielle, an entire menu of options when it comes to how do we track, survey, get data from our students in a way that is fair to them, that is equitable. And what I would just note is through our work, and we've gotten some great partners with the Search Institute out of Minneapolis that works on developmental relationships, Sanford Harmony working on social emotional academic development. The pieces that we're learning around the kinds of surveys that are useful for high school students and middle school students may be different from that which we use with elementary students. And the great learning that we've had even through this pandemic is the amount of engagement we now have when we're working with younger students, with their families. And just to give you a quick anecdote, we have one of these surveys, again, to think about a survey as a tool to a larger entry point, bridging of a relationship. We have surveys that should be lasting 10 minutes with our families that we work with in schools, and they go on for 45 minutes in some cases because there is so much that family wants to share with just the right kind of prompting around some important things that are incredibly important to them, to their household, to what's in their food pantry, to how they can access CARES dollars that they didn't know how to navigate on their own. Really kind of develops that fourth leg for us when we're thinking about conditions for learning is that family and community engagement. I think taking advantage of the fact that I think now more than ever schools have a window into family, and whether it's, hey, I need you to support your student during the Zoom interaction, that's a connection point that we've had with families now that we're, I think, bringing into the survey to develop a better relationship with the entire student.
Great, thank you, Ray. So we're nearing the end of our time together. We have until 3:55. So wanted to open it up to closing remarks from the three panelists, just reflecting on our conversation so far and the objectives that we set out for this session in terms of helping state leaders understand how to measure and improve school climate. Any final comments, final recommendations, final resources that you want to point to, or also final stories as well? And I'll go ahead and start again with you, Ray.
Let me just say that to Superintendent Wright and Krupa, what a pleasure to get to feel like I'm virtually connected to Mississippi and to Kentucky at the same time. There's just such a diversity of work and experiences that are happening all at once. And I will just say, as we're thinking about school climate and what it means to feel like we're living through this moment with a lot to write in our journals to future generations. There is a way to get this wrong, I think, and it's if we don't learn and don't do something to improve on what we know needs to improve on. And I think about the razor thin edge that some of our students, in many cases who are low income, that now make up close to 52% across the nation of students in our classrooms. I think we crossed that threshold about 4 years ago, where the majority of our students now are contending with the issues of poverty. That we do need to rethink how we rebuild public education in a way that allows teachers to do the tremendously difficult work that they do, principals to lead their schools, which is why I truly try to advocate for the support from the federal level that is helping to sponsor these programs that are, in our case, integrated student supports, something as critical as not putting the burden of climate all on a teacher, all on a principal, but working with those agencies that have evaluation and impact, whether that is through Title I dollars or Title IV dollars, and seeing an expansion of that, I think helps us create that world for public education for the changing demographic of our students.
Well, one of the things that we've done, and we took advantage of it to Ray's point about the CARES money and the money that was coming into the state, we put forward with the legislature a $200 million Mississippi Connects initiative. And now every teacher and every student has a device in their hand. We have added connectivity. We've added learning management systems to all of our schools. We're focusing on high quality instructional materials to load onto those. But one thing that we did, which really relates to this, but it was an expansion of that, Mississippi, to Ray's point, has the highest level of poverty in the nation. We do not have enough pediatricians. We do not have enough mental health therapists. And so we, as part of our initiative in Mississippi Connects, we are working now with the medical community to expand telehealth and teletherapy. And it really rang home to me after listening to my students, Krupa, to be honest with you, and listening to the stories that they were telling me when we were on the calls together, and my teachers that were telling me the same things about the struggles that they were having. So now we are working to expand telehealth and teletherapy across the state. Because we've got a lot of rural parts of Mississippi, so that if children or families need connections with either the physical end of it or the social and emotional end of it in terms of therapy, that they're going to have easier access to that regardless of where they live. And so we're real excited about that. We're just starting it. It's going to be at least a couple of years, till it's fully expanded. But I cannot tell you how excited the medical community was to come alongside the department and say, let us help you do this, because they were just so thrilled that other people would have greater access to physicians and therapists. And so real excited that that's going to be coming to Mississippi.
I just wanted to take the time to thank Danielle, Carrie, and Ray for having such a great conversation and for inviting me into this space. And I think if we're to take anything from this conversation is just the pure need to include students in these dialogues, just like what's happening right now. If you want to know about the climate of a school, I think it's simple enough to say you can just ask a student and they'll tell you how the climate is of their school. And I think that there's a really, truly untapped potential in students to inform research and advocate for school policies that they feel are conducive to them and are helpful to them. And I think that that's something really important, is to be able to create avenues like Carrie's Student Advisory Council, where students can discuss what their what they're feeling in school and how they feel like schools can best be improved. And places like that are truly essential to be able to improve school climate as a whole. But I also think something to be cognizant about in that moment is what students are not in part of those school climate councils, what students aren't able to be at the table for whatever reason they're having at that moment. And I think that's something to be cognizant about and to recognize what students aren't being heard in this moment and how we can bring them to the table as well. So I think that's something that can really truly help shape school climate for the better and for something that can be conducive for all students in this moment.
Yeah, thank you, Krupa, for that, and all of our panelists for your participation, your hard work, your commitment to students, and the expertise that you've brought to this conversation today. Before we close out with our last 2 minutes, I just wanted to summarize a couple of the key points and really underscore, I think, if there's anything that our participants walk away with, a couple of things. One is to ask students and to listen to students, and for state leaders in particular, to be thinking about the infrastructure that you can build to create avenues for listening to students, but also the partnerships that you can engage in to foster that ability to hear students. So the example of the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team, which is an external outside nonprofit organization, but is able to partner with the Kentucky Department of Education and able to deliver information to Kentucky state legislatures. And so thinking through just the power of those partnerships. We also spoke about both tools and people. And so thinking through, I think to the point around programs don't change lives, don't change lives, but relationships do. How do we leverage the people that we have at every level and outside of schools as well to achieve the positive climate that we want to have? And there are ways to do that I want to add aren't about adding new initiatives to Carrie's point. It's about pulling everything together in a coherent frame and using some of the funding that is already out there in terms of the CARES Act, in terms of AmeriCorps, in terms of investment in service, and finding ways to leverage all of that. And so to that end, I just wanted to plug that in January, the Aspen Institute and the Foundation for Excellence in Education will be publishing a playbook for state policymakers on this very issue. And so we hope that you will keep an eye out for that. We will certainly share it with all of our followers. And so the Twitter handles were shared earlier. Encourage you to follow Ray in Communities in Schools, to follow Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team, and Mississippi Department of Ed for the great work that each of these organizations is doing, and to keep an eye out for the playbook for more specific examples, including direct legislative and statutory language that you could just pull from in order to leverage directly in your unique state context. Again, acknowledging that each state and each context is unique, but there are specific policies and solutions that we can learn from and adapt. And so with that, I want to thank again the panelists and thank ExcelenEd for hosting the session, and thank all of our participants for joining us today. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.